This podcast contains adult content and discussions of first-time sexual experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Some stories may include themes that are sensitive or triggering for some audiences. Welcome to Sexual Encounters, the very first time. I'm MaryJane. This episode is called Not Here, Surely Not Here, because sometimes the first time isn't about your first time ever. It's about the first time in a place that feels unexpected or inappropriate. A pool, a car, a dorm room, a public bathroom, a plane at 3,000 feet. For some, it's a first time in that space. For others, the space becomes the setting for their first time ever. And that difference matters. Because when your first time experience happens in a place that feels rushed, risky, or exposed, it can shape how that moment is remembered, or even how it's valued. Was it thrilling? Was it awkward? Was it about desire or just circumstance? Today, we're exploring what happens when intimacy shows up where it's not supposed to, and how place, context, and timing shape the meaning of a first time. Joining us once again is the incredible Dr. Markie, an award-winning sexologist and relationship therapist who will be helping us unpack this conversation on first times in unexpected places. Hello, Dr. Markie. We're delighted to have you back for this episode.
Hello, MaryJane, and hello, listeners. I'm happy to be back. I'm excited to unpack this with you.
Dr. Markie, when we talk about first times in unexpected places, there's a distinction that feels really important, that a first time in that kind of setting can actually mean two different things. For some people, it's their first time ever, and it happens in that space. For others, it's their first time in that kind of place, but not necessarily their first time ever. My first time, for example, and we've talked about this before, was in a dorm room. So definitely not the rose petals and the champagne that I grew up imagining from the movies. And I wonder how much the setting shaped how I experienced it and how I've come to remember it. How do these two experiences differ psychologically and emotionally?
I think that's a really great, interesting / curious position to think about. As I've shared as well, my first time was in the home that I grew up in, right? So it was not at all like a public space per se. It was still a shared space, right? Kind of like a dorm. There's other people that are sharing that space, but it's not necessarily a public space. I think when we have our first time sexual encounters, like a literal first time encounter, like your sexual debut, just to the whole experience of sexuality and having sexual engagement. I think for many people, the experience does take place in a more private context. I do. I think it takes place in dorms, like you've shared, homes, right? Apartments, so on and so forth. And I think many of us do picture it more that way. And so there is a feeling of sort of built in safety around that in a way, and security, because it's matching or aligning a place that typically is already perceived as being somewhere and there's a degree of comfort. So I think there's that. Now, having said that, I'm sure there are people, although I don't know if I know any people actually off the top of my head, who have the unique intersectionality of not only is their first sexual encounter their first, but it's also in like a more public or unusual place. I suppose that can happen. I don't think that typically happens. And honestly, MaryJane, there is hardly no research on just first encounters that people have, whether it's their first sexual encounter or just they've had plenty of sexual encounters, but they want to try, someplace that's outside of those more stereotypical comfort spaces. Maybe they have some feeling of kink fetish, or maybe they've been raised in pop culture or read historical books dating back forever that talk about having sexual encounters outside of more private spaces. I think for many people, the feeling of wanting to have sex in more unusual places and the first time experiences people have with that, not necessarily their first sexual encounter, I think it has more to do with that kind of erotic excitement. In some ways, there might also be that feeling of getting caught and just, what if someone's watching and I don't know it? It's almost like it levels up the sexual encounter itself, because now it's not only about the sexual encounter itself, it's also about more of the uncertainty of what could happen when you have sexual engagement in a place like, a public place like a park, or, a train or an automobile or a plane, right? Any of those kind of settings that we see and hear talked about quite a bit in pop culture, but maybe we don't talk about it so much just in everyday conversation. So I think those can be different psychological and emotional experiences, and often are. And again, I'm not sure there's many people where their first time actual literal sexual encounter is in a less, whatever this means in scare quotes, traditional context.
And I suppose it also depends on on a number of things, maybe the age as well, the maturity of the people as well. And then maybe sometimes because of access, it may be difficult to find, a private space, especially for the younger generation. So I wonder, does that affect whether the experience is special or how they assign meaning to it later in their lives? Does the environment shape whether it feels intimate or just situational?
That's a great question. I appreciate that. I hadn't really thought of it this way. I think a lot of people, especially kind of our more stereotypical fairy book ideas, if you're more heterosexual, cisgender, this idea of I want my first encounter to be rose petals and candle lights and in a private setting, perhaps in a hotel, maybe. But again, that would still be in a private context. I think because of those layers, particularly within those sexual and cultural groups, I think we have this idea, that it's going to go perfectly. Back to those scare quotes. It's supposed to have, like you talked about, it was supposed to have this champagne and all these other things. We have these ideas about it, right? I was just reflecting, though, that it can also be the case. I'm kind of going to piggyback on the idea of, more queer dynamic, like gay men, for example. I don't think, now that I think about it, it might not be that unusual for your first encounter to maybe be in a more public context. Like it could be more like at a gay club or something, or at a kink BDSM space, which would be more public. I imagine still that might still be perceived as special, even though it might be more situational and not as planned out as the other story that we just talked about. But I do think there's still space for, like, oh, this is kind of like a community first time and what that can look like. And that can feel less private, but more like, well, my first is about also becoming part of community, not just my own encounter, but something bigger than that. But if you're looking at the people who have already had sexual encounters in their life and now they are intentionally choosing, or maybe they just happen upon a less common, less private space, I think definitely can feel special for people, especially if it was something they fantasized about and then they do all this planning. Definitely, like, sex on airplanes gets probably a tremendous amount of attention because of that. And actually, there's a service in Las Vegas, Nevada, in the US, where you can actually, they have that service. It's a private plane, and there's varying degrees of the length of time you can spend on this plane and the level of service. So it can come with It's completely closed off. There is a pilot, of course, but it's closed off. And you can have a full course meal and like the champagne and all that and have sex right there on the plane. And everybody, it's just you and the people that you're doing this with. And the pilot is already aware. I mean, it's built into the cost of this journey. And I have not had a chance to do that, but it definitely is something people do. And what I love about that kind of specialness and intersectionalities with, not doing the stereotypical what we're doing in private is in that instance, that's fine. That's legally agreed to, there's a contract, so on and so forth, versus those of us who might have made similar choices on public airlines in bathrooms or in seats with just a blanket covering you or whatever, that is not really legal. You could get in a lot of trouble. But I want to make sure the listeners know this. You're not allowed to have sex in public. You're not allowed to walk around without clothes on in public unless you're in designated places where that is allowed. And even then you're not supposed to be having sex in public. And so it's lovely that there are places that you could still live these special moments that are new to you and not get in trouble, with the law. Because oftentimes where you end up is actually on a sex offender registry. And we definitely don't want that to happen to people. And that includes like public parks. Some of us are ecosexual and might really love the idea of having sex in nature and, what's more of a public space rather than private land. And okay, but recognize that something could happen to you legally, and maybe that makes it more exciting. But also, I don't think anybody really wants to get in trouble for this, unless, of course, your ultimate real kink is you want to go to jail and then have sex in that public space. And then that brings us to a whole different rabbit hole. You know what I mean?
Yes. I mean, hopefully our listeners don't want to end up on the sex offender list and get into
Yeah.
that kind of
Don't do
trouble.
that. Don't do that. Yeah.
But speaking about the thrill and the excitement, I mean, this kind of takes us into one of the myths that I wanted us to also touch on, the idea that these kind of first times in unexpected or inappropriate places is always about the thrill or about the rebellion. But I wonder if that's too simplified. What do you think is actually going on beneath the surface in these moments? And we often assume it's about the adrenaline, doing something risky, getting away with it. But could it also be about pressure or even timing, privacy? And how do context and circumstances shape how intimacy happens, especially for these first time experiences?
I think that's a really great follow-up query. And really, this myth piggybacks in many ways off what we were talking about. So certainly, as we've talked about, sometimes things that even happen like in public, maybe at like restaurants or bars or taverns or pubs or dance clubs, whatever, sometimes those might be situations that aren't necessarily consensual. People have been drinking too much, then they feel peer pressure, something along these lines. And you would think, oh, but we're in public, so there should be kind of safety built into that. But a lot of times that's not the case. But I want to take that and put that in a different category like we do often. And if that kind of stuff is happening, there's actually places all over the world, not just in the US. For example, in the UK, if you are experiencing something like that in a public space, you can use the word Angela. You just tell staff, and then they know that things like that are happening. And I believe in Norway, it's Jessica. I don't know what you do if these are your actual names in these places, but I'm going to try not to lose sleep over that and worry. But I do want people to realize that if it is that kind of situation, there are mechanisms for that. So I'm going to set those kind of off to the side and focus on the things that are more consensual, obviously. So, in thinking about, like, let's say that, I'm a young person and I share a flat with people or I share a dorm, but my partner and I, really want to be intimate. It might be the case that we have to make choices to find places that are maybe more inherently public by nature. So this is where you'll hear stories of people having sex in vans or cars or so on and so forth. Or maybe you're in a small rural community, I still can't say that word, sparsely populated area, you can go to a dead end in the middle of nowhere. And I think you're at relatively little risk of whatever this means being caught by doing those actions. And still, it can be a really enjoyable experienced. Of course, when I was back in the days of sharing space with people, I would, of course, just put like a little like do not disturb thing on my dorm room door or like a handkerchief or something, tie it around, and then they would know. But then there was always the risk that someone might walk in, which on the one hand was probably a little exciting even then. So let's take that latter group. So it's not necessity why you're doing it, and it isn't some sort of peer pressure or less consensual situation. And let's say that it's on some level, and I think a lot of people feel this way, otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about this. There might be an erotic kink side to this or a fantasy side where you're like, yeah, but I've always wanted to do this, right? And I think a couple areas where it comes up is definitely in nature. I think people often fantasize about, I'm going to go hiking and we're going to throw down on top of a mountain or we'll be skiing. And I don't know why you'd want to do this in snow. It sounds like torture to me, but I'm from Alaska. We're going to throw down the ski poles and have a good time in the mountain, planes, trains, all these places. I don't think that's unusual to have those kind of thoughts. Otherwise, it wouldn't be written across time and space and demonstrated to us in film and cinema forever. If that is something, like I said, there are options. First, you would want willing, consensual people or partner that would want to do this with you that share probably a similar fantasy to you, because then it would be much more exciting that if you just want to do it by yourself. Let's not forget you could have self sex in these places too. Like, it isn't like you would have to do that with other people. You have options. There are, like I mentioned, certain planes, certain helicopters, certain campsite areas where it's already consensual to be engaging this in more of a public way. And probably the easiest, less expensive way is to touch on more of the kink BDSM dungeons or munches or play spaces where it's already set up. There's already an agreement that in this space, I can do these things in front of people or behind closed doors. They have those options too in these spaces. And people are already consenting to either hearing me doing these things, because some people really like the echophilia, right? They like to be heard or hear people. And that's the erotic sound that they're interested in, not visualizing, not the fear of being caught. And so there's a consensual dynamic there because now you can still do these things, but everyone has consented to that. There are many places across the US and Canada and many places even in Europe where they have those kind of play spaces. And I would definitely recommend, like, if this really feels like someone's like, they're like, if I don't do this in my life, I'm going to feel like I missed out because I only live once that I remember. I would say those kind of spaces are the least expensive and the easiest to access, right? And you still would be able to do these things without potentially violating other people's consent and also getting in trouble with the law.
But then, of course, there's something about romanticizing spontaneity. So, for example, a plane that you can book in Vegas versus just a Delta flight or whatever flight it is where you don't book and then it's spontaneous and therefore it feels real or authentic. What do you think we miss when we only frame these spontaneous moments as authentic and in the moment? And how can people reflect on whether a moment felt truly chosen or just unfolded?
Yeah, this is always the rub, right? In every conversation that we have, and then in larger context, especially when I'm talking to couples who come in and they're like, I'll pick something that isn't this context first because it gives us another opportunity to discuss it. So, I'll be working with people, and one of them will say, I really want flowers. Like, I really like it when you give me flowers or I get flowers. It makes me feel seen, right? It makes me feel valued. It makes me feel loved and it's romantic, right? And so the partner says, okay, I'll get you flowers. And then they go get them flowers. The problem then becomes the person feels like, but you only did it because I told you to. And it doesn't feel spontaneous or romantic, right? But it's like, well, then that's not really, it's not about the flowers, then is it? It's about something else. And I think humans crave both predictability. I think we truly do like to have some sort of, whatever this means, illusion of control over things. But then because of that need to have structure and order as people, then I think we like it when things feel spontaneous and unpredictable. So could you kind of have a bit of both? I think you can. I think possibilities are, let's say that I'm with a partner or I'm working with people who are together and they say, we have always wanted to have a sexual encounter on a plane, period. And I say, I offer first the option of, well, there's already a structure. You could plan it. I want to say it's not even, I mean, whatever this means, Mary Jane, it's not even really that much considering. I say, you could do this. And they look at me and they say, yeah, but we really want it to be like we're on the plane and she taps me on the shoulder and says, meet me in the bathroom in 2 minutes or whatever, right? Get up and walk over later. Okay. I mean, yes, you could do this. Certainly you could. And I get it. Having said that, you're still going to have, no matter what, we're already having a conversation about it. So there's no way, really, just like the roses, right? There's no way it's ever going to really be spontaneous, not really, because this is already something we both have agreed to and have interest in. So now it's really only a negotiation of the time and the place and the circumstance, less so that it will be spontaneous. Because the issue with the truly spontaneous would be, what if your partner really isn't consensual to that? And I can't imagine a worse situation that you end up in. I love Delta, so I appreciate you bringing them up. I mean, I even have Delta socks and I'm a huge loyalist. And I can't imagine anything more upsetting than for the first time ever, let's say I've always wanted to have sex on a plane and I have a partner, but I have no idea if they want to or not. And I finally get up the nerve, well, on the Delta flight to look at them and go, meet me in the bathroom. And they're like, absolutely not. So to me, that would feel worse, right? Like, especially, like, again, go back to our roses. If I say, I love roses more than anything, I really want them, and they go, absolutely not. I think I would always err on the side of, there's ways to make something that is pre-planned and consensual also feel spontaneous. You could book a trip to Vegas and you could get your partner excited on the public flight. You really could. And then you could land and say, guess what? I booked this follow-up flight. And I mean, I don't know. I'm living my own fantasy right now, given this rabbit hole. But I imagine that would still feel really exciting, right? So I just would invite people to think about, what do you mean by spontaneity? Because really in life, little things are really spontaneous. Most of the time we've prepared or planned, hopefully, or had some degree of consent in our life, ideally. And if not, then sometimes that might not go really the way we might want it to go.
Absolutely. And I suppose, and this ties to the next myth, that the unusual place always makes for a memorable experience, that maybe it doesn't if it's, like you say, if it's not pre-planned or if you've never talked about it. So, and then of course it affects how people then process this experience later on in their lives. How important is it then to communicate with your partner or partners when it comes to these kind of fantasies, if I may?
I always love questions about communication and fantasy. I think one of the most helpful things, just in general, is if people are in a dynamic with a partner or partners already, where you're already feeling like you can do some exploration together more in private context or more typical places. You can always open the door and say, hey, have you ever had fantasies or inklings or whatever, dreams of doing what we do in a different setting? And sometimes even just the conversation is fantastical enough that it gets people excited, that it changes even the context of where they are. And so one possibility can be, I mean, I was just, Mary Jane, I was just in Amsterdam for the first, well, okay, I've been to the airport a lot, but I've never left the airport. So finally, I went. And, I had had this idea in my head. I had grown up in a home where my father and my uncle, when they were young people, had shared stories of going to Amsterdam and window shopping in the red light district. And I thought that was just metaphorical, literally. Yep. And when I got there, I was like, "Oh my gosh. No, it's real. Like, that's a literal real thing." And, just that fantasy of hearing stories like that is almost it's more fantastical than the reality because the reality of that fantasy doesn't match what your own mind thinks. And so part of me thinks about, yes, it would be very memorable to be in Amsterdam and window shop with a partner and enjoy the red light district that way. And also, another possibility would be you do that in your own home where you literally set up a red light and you make it look like you're in a window. That might be almost more memorable and fantastical, depending on the kind of relational dynamic you have with someone and the way the fantasy plays out, than actually going or doing this fantasy in the actual real space of it. It's good to talk about things. Of course, I would recommend having a safe word, like, let's say I'm with a partner who has absolutely no interest in window shopping in red light districts. We would want a safe word and probably not the color red because otherwise that would be a distraction from the whole concept of the fantasy. Let's say it's pineapple, right? And they look at me and they go, "Ooh, pineapple. That's not really a fantasy I have interest in." And I go, "Okay, no worries. What if we just did that in our home?" And they go, okay, that would be, it feels safer, it feels more secure, but I also still get to fantasize. And so I guess in a way, yes, it can be about the place. I mean, I am an ecosexual, so things out in nature to me are like amazing. But I also am lucky because I'm from Alaska and we have like 5 acres of private land, right? And the only buddy watching is like a moose. But if I didn't have that, and I wasn't in Amsterdam, for example, there are ways to approximate. And so it might be ultimately less about the actual physical space, and for some people, and more about approximation and just living a fantasy and approximating the space and that reality.
And this, I guess, comes back to the idea that space isn't neutral. Where something happens can shape how safe we feel, how present we are, and how we remember it. And also, I suppose culture plays a role in this whole dynamic. And we spoke about this in the previous episode with you and Dr. Starr. Some people may find doing it in the kitchen, for instance, just appalling and germs and everything, right? But others may think it's exciting. So how does the environment influence consent, vulnerability, and emotional connection for couples?
Yeah, I think the environment can play a really big part. And I love that you brought up the example of the kitchen. Like, that's definitely a fantasy place for some people. But as I reflect on, like, my partner, one of my partners who's Saudi and Muslim, cleanliness is such a huge part of the cultural dynamic of that I actually am having a hard time picturing how that, or like even like having sex on the ground per se, right? Like without some sort of barrier. I'm imagining that would maybe go down the route of an ick, like a yuck rather than a yum, in those dynamics. Whereas for me, I would be like, whatever, like, let's screw the patriarchy. Let's have sex on tables, and no, I'm not going to cook for you. So those are very different positionalities. I think the number one thing, no matter what the context is, it needs to be first and foremost like consensual, and that needs to be communicated. And then I also think, like we've talked about, I think you do want safe words. I think you want an out. If you're going to be in more of a public space because you a legal public space, it's a consensual public space because you want that experience, then you're looking at who are we really inviting into this fantasy and who are we not? And a lot of that can be cultural too. When you look at communities that are more polygamous, rarely are those polygamous dynamics where it's one woman and her multiple husband partners all together, right? Whether it's a public or private space or vice versa. But either way, it really, I think, boils down to consent and communication. And not everyone has to agree in the sense that we don't all need to have sex on airplanes. It's okay if someone wants to. And if their partner doesn't want to, what does that mean? How do we approximate that? Do we approximate it? Do we just rent a small airplane that's on a lot for an hour or two from someone and make one person's fantasy come true without the other person feeling like that's a hard no?
And of course, now with things like phones, the cameras, public exposure is a different kind of risk, right? We've seen a lot of videos on social media, people being caught in the act, in broad daylight, in public spaces. And of course, sometimes alcohol is involved. So the guardrails are possibly lower, and there's a sense of maybe no one is really watching. I joke with my sister sometimes. I say, in this day and age, if you're going to do it with somebody, everybody should put their phones in a box, like lock it up, just to make sure there's no, there's no videoing. So, Dr. Markie, how do you see evolving environments shaping how people think about where intimacy can happen safely?
I absolutely, of course, I love this question because it intersects with the digisexual nature of the world we live in and have lived in for quite some time. I just think now we're a lot more aware of it. I mean, I'm thinking back and I don't remember the names of these people, but that guy and the woman that he was having the affair with and how they were caught at that game, being intimate, right? And it was everywhere, right? And then they realized they were right there on the screen in the game at real time and they duck and cover, so to say, right?
Yes, yes, I think from Goldman Sachs or something.
Right.
I
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Like and you're right. I mean, everybody in a certain way is sort of being watched kind of all the time, whether that's literally like eyes in the sky or, just the very nature of the technology that we all pretty much have on us all the time. First of all, I love your idea of if you're in a private space or even in a more public setting, it's not a bad idea to say, hey, let's everybody put our phones literally away. And also, I would say turn them off because it would seem they hear you all the time when you leave it on. And so you could go from like just having it over here, the conversation you're having, and probably after this, both of our phones are going to have like feeds of the thing in Vegas for the airplane sex that I've already mentioned, right? And anybody listening to this, I'm so sorry, you'll probably have that too. And it's not because MaryJane and I are in cahoots with them or anything like that. It's just the nature of the way technology works, right? In public play spaces, so in dungeons, in munches, in kink BDSM spaces, there is almost always already a built-in agreement around that. So if you go to those kind of spaces, there typically is already rules and restrictions where you have to leave your phone in the locker when you come in, okay, and you have your own locker. And it's set up that way because of these kind of concerns, right? Like not everyone should see what you're doing. In addition, I haven't noticed this on Delta flights, but I have noticed it on other airlines. KLM, for example, I was just on KLM and they tell you immediately no one is allowed to take pictures or record on this flight without other people's consent. So even on planes, they really don't want you to be recording everything and sharing that. That might not be the case. If let's say your fantasy is like, I'm going to have sex on this balcony, this public balcony, it's possible that your neighbors or people on the street or other people might see that. And it's possible they might record that. And it's possible then that might get shared. And I think people need to be aware of that. I mean, you need to be thoughtful about it, just like you would feel the same way if maybe you were deciding to go outside and dance or sing or wash your car. Anybody could be recording you and share that at any time. And I'm not sure how we safeguard against that. I guess you could bring like a tent type thing out onto the balcony and then it'd be real hard for them to see it, but you'd still get the sound component. But most people aren't that worried about sound being heard and then shared publicly. Certainly with partners, because another way to think about public space is maybe you have, a partner or you yourself are curious about recording your stuff, right? Like you literally do want to record your sexual encounters with yourself and or other people. There is some pretty good publicly available resources that you can use. I did have a partner that asked for this period about the whole relationship, not necessarily about anything being recorded sexually, just because they were a relatively well-known rapper, pop culture artist, and so anybody they ended up having any sort of sexual romantic engagement with, they had a contract that you would sign that just would not publicly out the relationship. If there were pictures taken of any kind, even just, not any sexual context, but pictures, those would not be shared without explicit, written consent by both parties. I know that sounds extreme, and also, I get it. I really do. If I was any more public than I am, which I'm not that public, I might do the same thing. And I wanted to say that the person used like a platform called like Rocket Launch, and it was a great platform. And so I would encourage people to think about that as well. It could be that part of your fantasy is recording stuff and the possibility of people seeing that. Having said that, I'm not sure you want just anyone to have access to that or to just automatically consent to being recorded without really having proper things in place. And so, like I said, I actually really appreciate that this person was really thoughtful that way. And it had more to do with who they were in positionality, and I get that. But I'm kind of saying maybe all of us should think about that. Maybe that's just the default. Maybe we all say, here's our DigiHealth agreement around this, here's an actual contract around it, because it also tells you something about someone if they're that prepared, and it tells you something about someone if they aren't comfortable signing something like that. So, yeah, those are just my thoughts.
I agree, Dr. Markie. Maybe it should be a default because there's so much sharing going on in these days with the social media.
Yep,
So, yeah,
yep.
indeed.
I know, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you wouldn't think that, but everybody's so digisexual. Like they're sending each other pictures and videos or they're taking them of each other. And we all think, okay, no big deal. But what if something goes wrong? Or what if that gets used to, I don't know, make an AI footage out of you? I mean, they can do that already anyway. So maybe the contract even needs to include you're not going to generate any AI images of me for us. I know that
Yeah.
sounds probably extreme, but now that I'm thinking about it, I'm literally like, maybe I should be doing this right now, like jotting this right after and do it. Right. Like, so thank you, Mary Jane. Thank you for bringing that to my attention
Yeah.
and everyone else's.
Because it's true. Because sometimes you share what you feel is a private picture, a private video to your friends, but maybe your friends don't see it that way, right?
That's
And
right.
then they share it,
That's right.
with somebody else. And
You're
then,
totally right. And it doesn't
yeah,
have to even be sexual. You're right. In fact, this goes back a ways ago, about 10 years ago. My colleagues and I, and it was inspired by my now adult kid human, but when they were a kid human, they had long hair and they had taken scissors or a shaver and cut half of it. And then they hid that half like underneath the couch while their father and I were like in the garage, like working on the car or something. And we come back in and she's kind of giggling and also a little like uncomfortable. And I'm like, what's going on, baby? And she goes, nothing. And I look at her hair and I go, what happened? And she goes, yeah, I cut it off and it's under here and we can just put it back on. And I'm like, That's not how hair works, baby. And then she starts crying. And I'm like, it's okay, honey. We'll go ahead and cut it all off, which is going to suck, but it'll grow back. And she was like, okay, mama. So we did. And then, of course, her father and I thought nothing of it. Like, this is our 3-year-old, 4-year-old kid. We posted onto our Facebook, which is just our family. It's not public. And then 6 months later, we're hanging out with her father's side of the family, and one of them says, an uncle says, "Oh, your hair grew back," to her. And this poor kid is mortified and goes, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "I saw this on your dad's Facebook." And she goes, and then she sits us down, this 4-year-old, and goes, "What are you doing? You're posting pictures of me?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, baby, like not a lot, but like the number one things that get posted on Facebook are actually parents, particularly first time parents sharing pictures of their kids. That's still the case, even now." And she goes, "I don't consent to that. And from here on out, actually, I want you to ask anytime that you A, take a picture first, and then B, decide you're going to share that somewhere. And if I'm not okay with either, then I don't want you to do that." And this really led to me going down a rabbit hole of then doing research on with consent as a hashtag. This has been posted with consent. Everybody that was in this picture knew where I was going to share it. I asked if I was going to tag. So I agree. It isn't just about sexuality and intimacy. With consent should be across the board. And we shouldn't assume. You just don't know how comfortable people are with that. And I especially feel this way about people under the age of 18. My poor kid has a whole life online before she's even an adult that she didn't really consent to. And that was with parents that were more informed thanks to her weird 4-year-old brain. I love a lot of my friends, for example, and colleagues, but every time they post pictures of their kids, I intentionally don't like it. I don't usually give it any traction. And occasionally I'll talk to him afterwards and I'll be like, "Does your kid really want you to do that?" You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. And I didn't have to worry about this because I'm like a tail end of the Gen X, beginning of the millennial. So the worst I had to worry about is my parents would invite people over and make them look at a family album or like watch like a slide deck of all the pictures they took on a trip. And most people never wanted to do that. So I just, my private life as a kid was private. And everybody has the right to privacy, regardless of their age and regardless of whether it's sexual or not.
I no longer post my son on social media also because of that very reason. Once he reached the tween years, it was like, "No, I don't want you to take a picture," or "No, I don't want you to post a picture of me or send a picture to your sisters." I totally agree that they also have the right to consent to whether their life should be on social media or not.
Yeah, and it helps them learn. Having those very intentional, overt conversations also helps them understand I am not supposed to send private pictures of my body to other young people or adults, right? That's the
Yes,
other thing,
yes,
right? Like if we've already got that template, because that's against the law, that's child pornography. If we've
yeah.
already got a template and we've talked about it with our young people, then they get it already. So it's great that your young humans have already started realizing that.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Markie, for this whole discussion. It's been very interesting, and I hope that the listeners can take away some positives from it, and I hope that they've learned from the conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
I appreciate you so much. I appreciate the listeners, and I am so grateful for the conversation, and I'm looking forward to many more. Thank you.
You're listening to Sexual Encounters, the very first time. If this episode resonated with you and you have a story about sex in an unexpected place, DM us or email us sexualencounterstheveryfirst@gmail.com, or you can fill in the form anonymously on bit.ly/Let's Talk First. Next time on Sexual Encounters, the very first time, we're talking about the oral story and how it shapes how we connect intimately with others. Thank you for listening.